Okay, go on.
So I was saying, Gibbs and Cram, this is a pen name for two feminist geographers that wrote everything together since the early 90s. And they introduced this concept of diverse economy. I don't know if you might have come across this graphic representation of the economy in the form of an iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg is the fact that it's typically represented in economic discourse. So the market, including the labor market, wage labor, and all market transactions. And the base of the iceberg represents all the different kinds of activities, and I should call them the different kinds of work that are carried out in society, that are unpaid or unwaged or informal, and that actually sustain the economy. The economy would not exist without this base, right? So this image was very powerful and introduced and has been largely used in the field of feminist economics, feminist political economy, and it's only one of the different ways in which feminist scholars have been helping to reconceptualize work, what work is, what do we mean by work, and how is this definition, different definitions are relevant to the politics of work and work relations, no? And in what I'm trying to argue here is that these different definitions of work and labor are also relevant to the politics of the climate and ecological change. So based on this approach, I understand labor as the ensemble of waged and unwaged workers acting under different property regimes and different technological regimes to produce both exchange value and use values. In all epochs, labor is what produces people, food, commodities, infrastructures, services. In the broadest sense, labor is the subject that allows for the production and reproduction of life on Earth. But since all production requires metabolic interchanges with the biosphere, then this means that labor is inherently a metabolic subject. It is inherently an ecological subject, whereas ecological does not refer to the sphere of consciousness, or at least not alone. Ecological here has a very material meaning. It refers to the metabolic interchange between societies and the biophysical world. No? Because this interchange, this exchange of matter and energy that gets metabolized through the labor process and then transformed into goods, commodities, waste. No? This is what makes the materiality of environmental change, no? of the interchange between societies and their environment, and this all is mediated by labor. So labor occupies a key position in social metabolism. Now, in this key position of labor, waged labor represents a minority of it in quantitative terms, no? So the majority of this labor, of this work, is unwaged, and so this unwaged work has been conceptualized by the Australian political economist Henri Salé as meta-industrial. So all the work that goes around industrial labor, which is typically waged labor, all the work that is around it and that sustains it, no? This meta-industrial labor takes place both in urban context and in rural context, and it is associated with giving birth, nurturing, educating, caring for human beings along all their life. But also subsistence production, including, for example, urban farming or fishing or gathering in rural communities, or peasant farming, also with the maintenance and restoration of the commons, both the rural and the urban commons. So there is a lot of work, unpaid meta-industrial work, that communities and community organizations do to maintain or create the urban commons. No? Now, for meta-industrial labor, defending and reproducing the commons is key to securing access to the means of reproduction, both the means of production and the means of reproduction, the production of life. And at the same time, it's a way of putting boundaries to capitalist extraction. Now, this view of work, of course, this view of work invites to revisit consolidated concepts of, for example, of working class. What do we mean by working class? No? Typically, what is meant by this term is the blue-collar industrial worker, typically a male worker, whereas if we want to elaborate an anti-essentialist language of class, which actually takes into account the material relations that exist both in the relationship between society and the biophysical environment, and within society, within human groups, on how life is produced and reproduced, then we have to revisit the idea of working class, of what working class is. So I see the condition of working class as delimited by these two types of relations. First, relations with capital, which can lead to conflict, but also to a co-optation or subsumption. And these relations with capital concern not only the exploitation of waged work, but also the free appropriation of the unwaged work, because much of the unwaged, the unpaid work that is done in society ends up feeding and sustaining the capitalist system. No? It's, as Nancy Fraser puts it, capital free rides upon unpaid labor, because this unpaid labor is essential, it's necessary to the functioning of the capitalist system. But also, as part of the relations with capital, there is institutional racism, the fact that, or institutional sexism, the fact that some kinds of work are cheaper and are more exploitable, and some kind of labor are more more easily dismissible than others. No? Capital also thrives upon differentiations within labor. And of course, the enclosure of the commons is also part of the conflict with capital, with the relationship between labor and capital, the fact that capital tends to permanently appropriate, accumulate, and dispossess in order to create the conditions for capital reproduction. And one other aspect that it's also part of the experience, working class experience, how working class people experience their relation with capital, is the depletion of bodies, the contamination of territories, what we could also understand as ecocide or biocide, no? The fact that the capital accumulation also thrives upon depleting bodies and contaminating their environment, because this is part of the profit making, no? It's structurally essential to profit making. Now, there is a second kind of relations that also, in my understanding, also characterize the condition of working class, relations within the class, interclass, intra-class, among different sectors of the class itself. You could conceptualize relations among different subjectivities of labor, different labor subjects. And these are contradictory relationships, because like the relationships with capital are both conflictual and co-opted somehow. So the relationship within the class, within the labor class, are I see them as geared around these two poles. Let's say on one side, mutual interdependency, no, and this interdependency is also metabolic. People depending on one another to survive. But at the same time, this interdependency should not be romanticized, because it incorporates power inequalities within the class. Sex, gender, race, ability, a number of inequalities that are within the class. So this definition, I think it's broad enough to include different labor subjectivities, but also interrogating their relationships with it, which is non-fixed and dialectical, their relationships with each other, with their environment, and with the subjectivity that stands as other than class, other than labor, sorry, which is the subjectivity of capital. But I actually prefer to call the master subjectivity. And this is a point that I make in the book that Dario was mentioned before, my latest book, Forces of Reproduction, where I argue that that it's not enough to talk about, when we talk about the Anthropocene, it's not enough to talk about the fact that the Anthropos is actually capital and capitalism, because master relations, by which I mean relations of inequalities and power, are embedded in and constituted of capitalism, but they do not coincide with capitalism. They can also be found in different systems. So who, or rather, what is the master? In my understanding, what I mean by this is, first of all, the master is capital. It's the subject of the ongoing, never-ending process of accumulation, the owner of the means of production, in its various concretizations, no? The employer, the corporation, the bank, states, the trade and finance organizations, intergovernmental agencies. The master is the subject or the system that people work for. Who is your master? Your master is the one you work for. And the unequal labor relations that reproduce themselves over and over via dispossession, exploitation, and objectification. But the master is not only that. Black feminist, intersectionality theorists, indigenous, peasant, queer, and ability theorists have made it clear that the master is not only defined by relations of class, of property, but also, or labor in the sense of waged labor, but also violations of sex, gender, race and ethnicity, colonial, spatial, ability and species relations. What does this mean? It means that we have to learn to see all these inequalities as part of capital, even if they do not coincide with capitalism. And this is why I prefer to use the term master and mastery relations to signify this broader ensemble of inequalities that define the conditions of life for the subjects of labor, because this is the world in which the labor subjects live, both industrial and meta-industrial workers, both waged and unwaged workers. Just as the subject of labor cannot be reduced to waged workers, so anti-capitalist struggle cannot be reduced to class struggle, but must tackle all inequalities, also identifying their intersections. And this brings me to the second dimension, which is the dimension of interlabor relations. Waged and unwaged work in capitalist societies are interdependent, but in unequal power relations. Waged work and exchange value are premised upon, as social reproduction theory tells us, they are premised upon the free riding of society upon unpaid caregiving work, but unpaid work, on the other hand, is economically dependent upon waged work, both at individual level, because unpaid workers depend for their living to somebody's wage, and also on societal level, because, for example, social policies depend on the production of national domestic product, on economic growth. So this dependency between the two categories is mediated by that universal medium of wealth, which is money. And this general rule, the rule of money, is well known by unpaid or underpaid caregivers who depend on someone else's wage or on the state and state's cash transfers to get by. It's also very well understood by peasant farmers who are constantly forced into debt by the agrarian policies of capitalist agriculture. Even if engaged in waged work, people are not defined by it. Inevitably, we are all defined by a much larger web of relations with unwaged and subsistence work and with the work of non-human nature, which make the conditions for our existence. Waged workers have been born and nurtured, socialized, fed, and cared for by both waged and unwaged care workers, typically the women in their communities. They are connected to other wage workers via local and global commodity chains and care chains, which are largely built upon colonial relations and structural racism. So these are the complex and contradictory links that connect working class people to one another, in addition to capital, of course. Moreover, all workers breathe, drink, eat, and regenerate their energies thanks to the work of non-human agents, plants, bacteria, fungi, and other animals. So all these metabolic agencies are to be seen as linked in uneven and changing ways through relations of class, gender, race, species, age, ability, etc. Okay, so the rule of money that I was mentioning before, we have to also consider that the rule of money is constantly challenged by an important dimension of labor struggle, which is commoning struggles. Defending or expanding this sphere of the commons has been historically has always been an important part of class struggle, no? Of resisting proletarization, and also means for people to gain some freedom from capital, from freedom from the wage relation and from commodification. But at the same time, also the commoning struggles have been also have had an ecological dimension. No? It's been way of protecting non-human nature from extraction and from wasting. So commoning struggles are a very important dimension of the place of labor in the ecological politics. In the global history of capitalism, commoning struggles have been mostly led by the meta-industrial labor class because they have mostly had to do with land. No? So indigenous, Black and peasant communities, and especially the women in all of them, and I will get to that in a minute. So all those with the lesser access to money, this is all related to the rule of money. Those with the lesser access to money and at the same time engaged in the work of gathering or growing food, raising children, and caring for the ill and the elderly, so typically the women in these communities, are those who have had the greatest material vested interest in defending the commons. Okay, so how much time do I have? Oh, we have. Okay. Okay, great. I don't have much more to say, and then.
This is exactly what the yeah, so we can you are free to do what you like.
Yeah. No, I will.
The only thing is that you have this coffee break at some point.
At 4:30.
And you can finish before, and then we can have one or two comments.
Yeah.
Or fill all the time, and then
Okay.
we shift the comments to after the break.
Okay.
Totally free.
Okay.
Will be adapted. We'll
Yeah.
see when you stop, and then we manage if to add the
Yes,
discussion of we collect comments from. Okay.
So, because I wanted to problematize also this aspect of the commoning struggles a little bit. Why? Because while we all, I think we are all familiar with this discourse of commoning and a little bit romanticized discourse of commoning, no? In which commoning struggles appear like really the apex of what an anti-capitalist struggle should look like, etc., etc. I've been also socialized into this narrative, but a little bit recently, I've been asked, because I have to write an article about feminism and commoning, and I start digging a little bit into this. And I'm starting to have some doubts and questions, because if you look at the history of commoning, you realize how women have been typically excluded within the communitarian access to land or forest or water or et cetera, no? In rural communities, historically speaking, but also not so historically. In many rural communities today, still many women are still excluded from the management of the commons or access to the commons. So I came across the work of Indian agrarian economist Veena Agarwal. How many people are familiar with her work? Not many. Okay. Okay, so Veena Agarwal is actually feminist economist, one of the founders of the field of feminist economics. And she did research back in the 80s and 90s on women in rural communities in India. And then she came up with this wonderful book that's called A Field of Her Own, which is clearly recalling Virginia Woolf's Room of Her Own, no? Discussing the very delicate question of gender and poverty, right? And so if you read the book, of course, it refers to the women in India in the 80s and 90s. So it's not, but if you read her most recent work, she's been also continuing her research along that line, and not much has changed. Some things have changed, also thanks to her. Her book was instrumental in passing the new laws in India about women's access to land, but many problems are still there. Anyways, her point basically was that since women were de jure or de facto denied access to land, this made them the proletarians within the community, the proletarians within their own families, their own households, because they were dependent on either the wage or the property of the males in their families and their communities. And they had to, basically, women were actually working for the men in their communities, because the men in their communities were the basically owners of the means of both, or either production or reproduction, no? Or either money or land. And so this recalls the fact that property must be problematized as well, no? And there are subjects that have been historically denied access to property. This is the truth. This is the historical truth. And this lack of access to property has determined a condition of dependency, of subalternity, of inequality within the labor class. So I'm not saying this just to say, okay, so for feminists, the commons do not make sense. That's not my point. My point is that commoning must be also seen from the different subjectivities that are part of the community of dispossessed. There are different subjectivities there, and they may have different claims over the commons, over property, and different needs also. And these are also determined by power inequalities among themselves, and not only with the inequality with capital. Okay. We could maybe go back to there in the discussion if you're interested. So I think this is my last slide. So what I'm doing in the book is putting together these different articles and trying to identify some typologies, also some processes or trends or differences in the ways different labor subjects are positioned with respect to the ecological crisis. So what I'm trying to understand is the ecological subjectivity of labor, no? and not as a homogeneous subjectivity, but as a multiple subjectivity with multiple claims and demands. So the first subjectivity that I talk about is the organized labor, the trade unions and the labor movement, and this concretizes currently in these campaigns for which I call climate jobs, but it's not just the climate jobs campaign, but all those campaigns and also demands that tend to respond to the dual challenge of the climate crisis, no? Which is the challenge of extinction of human beings, of life, but also the unprecedented crisis of inequality that we have been witnessing, no? in the past few decades, intended here in the sense that in Piketty terms, no? Inequality in terms of income. So responding to these two challenges at once, the labor movement, intended in its entirety, with its, of course, with many differentiations, has put forward this response. And the significance of these campaigns is that of rejecting the logic of occupational blackmail. The logic that any job is better than no jobs, and that all working class people want is jobs. Now, the discourse is different. No, working class people, workers want climate jobs, green jobs. They want jobs that are not only bringing income and economic security, but are also saving the environment, no? And they are also responding to a challenge that is it's a challenge for everyone, for working class people, including working class people. So jobs are not seen as a priority with respect to the environmental threats, as was labor discourse for a long time, no? And environmental threats are not seen as the unavoidable price to be paid to economic growth or economic security, etc. Instead, both environmental and social insecurity are seen as a consequence of neoliberal capitalist globalization over the past 4 decades. Normality, which now must be replaced with something else. So all of this is relatively new in the labor discourse on the environment, in the sense of labor organizations. And here I'm referring to the global climate jobs campaign. You can Google them and find out what they are about. Started from climate jobs the first climate jobs campaign started in late 2008, between 2008 to 2014 in the UK and South Africa. And then they expanded to Portugal, France, Norway, Canada, other countries. And now they are articulating with each other through this global climate jobs campaign. But here I think we could also include some Green New Deal, let's say the Green New Deal proposal, no? Which is inspired to the same principles or very similar principles. But this, of course, comes from a very longer history. So it's not like all this has been sprung out from nothing. There is a much longer history that encapsulates labor organizations' ability to keep under control the capitalist extraction of natural resources, and especially capitalist wasting contaminating territories and depleting bodies through active resistance from trade unions and labor organizations from within the wage relation. Okay, so it's not like the wage relation is the enemy of the environment. It's not. Okay, so the second form of ecological subjectivity of labor, it's the feminist strike. Also here broadly intended to include all those struggles and movements and campaigns and forms of struggle that come from recognizing the structural sexism and how production is and economic growth are premised upon the free appropriation of unpaid work. Now, this unpaid work that in the 70s was identified with housework, now it's intended in a much broader sense. It's not just housework, it's not just domestic work, it's all the work that people do. When I was referring to the economy iceberg before, it's all the work that is below the tip, no? The work that is unpaid, unwaged, and it's community work, it's volunteering, it's taking care of non-human life of the urban environment or the rural environment or non-human animals, and all those exchanges also among people that are essential to production and reproduction, but are not paid for. So here the claim is a claim for access to the means of reproduction, and mostly to money. No, it's not just the Clear Income campaign that's been initiated by the Global Women's Strike as a legacy of the Wages for Housework campaign, but it's also the new Namenos claim for self-determination, no? And the fact that people have a right to self-determination as a recognition of inequalities, as not a recognition, as a compensation, not even compensation, as a measure to tackle power inequalities that particularly affect people along lines of sex, gender, race, and other forms of inequality. So originally the claim here was that caregiving is essential to society, and this work. It's not natural. It's not something that is inscribed in women's biology somehow, no? But it's social. Caregiving is social, and it's socially imposed by some sector of society upon other sectors of society, also through process of proletarianization, by excluding certain subjects from property, from money, from access to jobs. And so making, and Silvia Federici, for example, has written very beautiful essays on this, exactly how historically the figure of the housewife has been historically produced by excluding women from access to jobs, to money, and to land. Because somebody had to take care for free. So the claim is caregiving is work, it should not be free. We want the money we are owed. There's a debt. There's a debt that capitalist society and all societies truly have towards unpaid caregivers. And this is Ariel Saleh calls this embodied debt. And it's a category that she puts together with the other forms of debt of capitalist society. Ecological debt and social debt. Social debt is exploitation, no? The work that the surplus labor that waged workers are deprived of. And ecological debt is the relation of exploitation between the colonizing and colonized parts of the world, and the ecological unequal exchange. And this today is also understood as climate debt, no? Because the colonized world is the one that has the least contributed to climate change, and it's the one who is paying the most the price of climate change. So there is a debt of the colonizing world. And embodied debt is the debt accumulated towards generations of free caregivers. So this movement demands not only money, but demands also access to money. Some also here Regina Woolf is inspirational. It's in the words of Selma James, some money that we can call our own. Okay, so breaking this relation of this proletarian relation within the household or within the community. And this money is seen as an enabler for caregivers to be free from oppressive, exploitative, or abusive relationships, and for care itself to be socially valued rather than naturalized or hidden. And I think that this connects directly to the third dimension, and I include here the third dimension of ecological subjectivity of labor, which is broadly intended as land struggles for land, but from, for example, the peasant movement, food sovereignty, agroecology movements, indigenous sovereignty, all those movements that struggle for access to land, because land still matters. Land still matters as a means of production and reproduction, but also as a means to autonomy from capital and the autonomous life projects and the possibility of developing non-capitalist life projects, also in terms of, also in ontological terms, in terms of ways of relating to the non-human, as it is in the case of indigenous communities. But not only, there is nowadays something that calls itself peasant feminism, for example, and it's as part of the peasant movement. And it's starting to emerge as a distinct form of feminism, distinct from urban, white, middle-class feminism, distinct with its own needs and demands, but also with its own ontologies and its own ways of understanding society and its own visions for future society, which are not based on the priority of getting access to jobs or the labor market, has been for the feminist movement for a long time. No? And all the point, the parity feminism, all the point was seemed to be to give women access to the labor market. And peasant feminism, it's not about that. It's about actually access to land. It's much more connected to the work of Bina Grawal, I think. Also, but we should ask her what she thinks about it. I didn't have the chance. Okay, so and here I think that also what is here part of this, of course, land struggles are also struggles for commoning in terms of access to forests, access to the ocean, access to parts of the world in communitarian access as a form of conservation, as a way of conserving and opposing extraction and commodification of life in these territories. So it's a different form of conservation. It's a conservation. This is a conservation that is not premised on the class politics of separating the people, working people from the environment. It's actually premised on the opposite. No, on the opposite principle of keeping people connected to non-human nature as a means of subsistence. And this is a form of, this is how conservation should be seen. So basically, what I would like to do is to look at both the potentialities and the contradictions and the limits and the internal problematics of all three forms of ecological subjectivity of labor. And I think doing this is challenging, but it is also necessary if we want to imagine a political ecology. We could call it a political ecology of labor, no? And what is challenging is that these three forms of labor subjectivity, ecological subjectivity of labor, are not necessarily compatible with each other. They might also be in conflict with each other. They might also be, or at least connected in an equal way. Waged workers in the global north participate in the racial colonial division of labor. We have to remember this. Their salaries and pensions are made to depend on the profitability of globalized capitalism. And the dirtiest and most insecure jobs among their ranks are typically reserved to workers, to migrant workers from racialized communities. Waged workers also participate in the sexual division of labor because they benefit from unpaid caregiving work, but also from wage gaps and unequal access to career opportunities that still separate male from female or transsexual workers. So it is crucial to be aware of these internal inequalities, which, even though they are not produced by workers themselves, or even when they are not produced by workers themselves, they separate and alienate workers from each other at various scales. At the same time, waged workers are not to be seen as a privileged category in itself, as you know, we have been also somehow induced to do by neoliberal discourse, no? That waged workers are privileged. Conflating labor rights with privileges would be a huge misunderstanding, leading to dismiss the key importance of labor organizing as a force opposing the master. As representatives of waged workers, trade union organizations must grapple with all these complexities and unequal relations while also maintaining their constitutive mission. And this often results in intractable contradictions. So to conclude, the political ecology of labor to me means the ecological consciousness of waged and unwaged workers, which arises from their direct experience of environmental and social inequalities. So a non-identitarian and non-essentialist approach to class, which allows us to see working class subjects as potential system changers. And I think that only a combination of these different forms of labor subjectivity, of labor's ecological subjectivity, can result in something in some forms of climate politics which might be revolutionary in the sense of not compatible with the continuation of the current system. And this makes key the need for alliances. Okay, I'll conclude here.
Thank you very much. So, we can, okay, let's do it in this way. I am the master in this case. I take advantage of my position and I start a little conversation with you, Stefania, about some points. So the clever part of the story starts. I will use this time for a little conversation with you. Okay, the first point is about the your argument resembles, of course, from a different point of view. That one that was developed in Manchester about the foundational economy, that is not about paid and unpaid work, but is about the economy that provides for the everyday life of all the people. That, of course, is a matter of care. That is a matter of school education, health, waste management, food, and so on and so forth. In this case, what seems to me in common is the visibility or not of what we are dealing with. In other terms, also in the case of foundational economy, we take for granted this kind of stuff, this kind of services and goods. We feel the loss of education when schools are closed. We have seen this during the pandemic. We feel the loss of health when we can't reach a hospital because the hospital is incomplete and disengaged during the pandemic. So it's something that exists sometimes, and we are all connected with this. So the unpaid work of care, but we can feel it only when this is not immediately we can have it in a sense available. Yeah. So this was just a connection with this kind of argument about foundational economy. I have to say that this idea to decoupling master from capitalism is really interesting and made me more comfortable than with the concept of capitalism. That I feel very, very, how to say, a sort of value shelter that covers everything and makes everything functioning in the same way. You are saying that master is the web that enables in a way enact capitalism, but is not the capitalism, and maybe master is able also to grasp something that comes from antagonistic movements or the same people that are contesting the master himself. Then this is a question. Can we differ? Of course, yes, but can you say something more about differences in these arrangements that connect paid and unpaid work in the territories? I suppose that this is not indeed all the same all over the world. There are different arrangements between this kind of connection between paid and unpaid work. And then about commons. You mentioned commons in relation with rural communities in order to underline also how these rural communities are basically traditional, way of organizing gender division of labor. Yes, and I would say that also when it's not about rural communities, commoning is not necessarily the solution. Indeed, if we look at, for example, something more technological, like the communities of renewable energy communities, that sometimes is, resemble this kind of functioning of colony. Again, we have gender asymmetries. With the colleague Ivano Scotti, we participate to an Horizon 2020 project looking at how the energy transition is fostered right now. And what seems really relevant is not the point that there are gender inequalities, but that gender is not an issue for the women in this kind of scenario. This is something like Castoriadis yesterday when we recall the imaginary, we have this, it's something that is really naturalized in a way. But I'm saying that in our research, also women says that gender is not a problem at all. But there are statistics that show clearly that is a completely gender asymmetry in terms of position, in terms of power, in terms of money, paid work in this case, and so on. Yeah. Then this argument about this another question. The argument about the knowledge of labor organization in order to manage this kind of trade-off between labor and environment. This can be said every time, everywhere. I'm from Puglia. I have in mind what happened in Taranto with Dilva. I'm not sure that sometimes the unions were, able to manage this kind of conciliation. I don't know how to call it. And finally, about Virginia Woolf, you have mentioned it several times, and I mentioned her because of the lighthouse. That is the novel that Pierre Bourdieu recalls in the masculine domination. No, I'm not able to know in French. In that case, it displays very well how the care work of female is useful to reinforce, to take care of the power of the male that is imprisoned, I don't know how to say, is encapsulated in this very, strong role of the dominant. It's a paradoxical way to see to the power, but it seems that those females that are providing care for take care of the power of the man are the most proactive, character of the story, while the men are just the subject of the power that have to be played. So the last is connected with this. Can we say that this division of labor, who, of course, is resistant in time to be changed or to be modified, but in relation with the transformation of post-industrial society, maybe something could be seen in terms of division of labor between sexes, in terms of taking care of that labor care. That's it. Thank you.
I wouldn't want to take this further 15 minutes. I would rather listen to more questions.
There is a second discussion.
There is a second discussion, so I will reply at the end.
Okay, so you prefer to connect
Yeah.
the other discussion?
Practically, yeah.
So Paul,
I've talked a lot so far.
Make a break.
after the break.
So,
Yes, can be. It depends how much time you need.
How much time you need?
Great.
Great, we have enough. We can choose to to anticipate. No. Then it is a rush. Then it is a rush.
Because the service is a little bit, we cannot anticipate.
Okay, so we can collect to count.
Unless they are already there.
We have
But
15
check.
minutes.
But
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes all the sense. Quindi? Ok. Oh, come over.
I speak right now. That's okay. I come back already.
Okay. Magari mi sposto io.
No, no, no.
No, anche perché lì.
No, hi everyone. Really happy to be here. I want first to thank the organizers because I'm really happy to be in this summer school, and I'm really happy also to discuss the work of Stefania, which is really difficult, in fact, to discuss Stefania's work. Because as you see, it's huge, and also it's my boss, so that's okay. No, it's a joke. So okay, I would like. So we heard right now the discussion presentation of the next book of Stefania. So the future of Stefania Barker. I want to speak more about the past. So I would like to come back to three essential aspects of Stefania's thinking. Firstly, that will be my three parts. The contradiction between labor and ecology, the apparent contradiction between labor and ecology. Second, the centrality of the forces of reproduction in the analysis of capitalism and domination. And thirdly, the forms of political organization linked to interspecies labor. Sorry, I just need the time. Oh, I can speak for only.
no, it can take all the time.
Yeah, but
Or you can continue after this one.
yeah.
We are speaking about labor, so
So,
please do something.
so for each of these three terms, I will seek to show the specificity of Stefania's work in political ecology in general and raise a question based on an example each time. So let me begin with the apparent contradiction between labor and ecology. So Stefania actively participating in the constitution of the field of environmental labor studies. Environmental labor studies is an interdisciplinary field that focuses on working class environmentalism and the relationship between labor and nature from the perspective of workers, which is really important. But the most common narrative, and Stefania already talked a lot about it, so I will be like fast on it. The most common narrative in environmental labor studies is the following. Part of the labor movements, especially the trade union movement, has defended labor, especially employment, to ensure decent living conditions for workers. However, most wage employment in the capitalist economy is dependent on the extraction of limited resources or the emission of greenhouse gases. So, in fact, we could say that defending employment and therefore growth would mean defending the continuation of a policy of appropriating the free forces of nature. Hence, one of the main political contradictions in the contemporary environmental politics is the next one. Either we defend labor and employment, or we defend the environment. In short, it is an alternative between reducing activities to protect nature or increasing jobs to defend workers. And in fact, we completely inherit this history. When we see the understanding of labor in contemporary environmentalist thinking, and in particular in climate movements. In fact, it's really rare to hear like ecological movements or environmentalism to speak about the place of labor, as Stefania already puts it. So for me, it seems that the main contribution to Stefania's environmental labor studies is the distinction between eco-modernism and of labor and working class ecology. Eco-modernism refers in general to the idea that technical development provides solutions to the ecological crisis. So it shows a confidence in the progress of a certain instrumental rationality. For example, wind farms and wind engines to decarbonize the economy. So the numerous oppositions against this technical development came mainly from local, autonomous, commoning, and ecofeminist movements. There has been a split, in fact, between radical anti-growth environmentalist struggles and a labor movement for green growth that has sometimes allied itself with green capitalism. So I think that the idea that eco-modernism is a hegemonic project that has allowed certain popular classes to adhere to the ideology of progress. It's a basic but really fundamental idea of Stefania. It's an hegemonic project in order to allow the popular classes and working class to adhere to the capitalism. On the contrary, what is a working class ecology, which is like at the beginning a strange concept? I think it defends that the social dominations, the basic idea, the social dominations and the ecological crisis have a common root, a common element. And this common element is the dispossession of the living beings from access to their condition of subsistence. So the experience of dispossession, of the private appropriation of reproductive forces, is the source of the ecological crisis and of social dominations of class, gender, race, or also ecological injustice. So I would like to present really quickly an example of workers' adherence to eco-modernism. Ah yes, no, just a few things about this table. I think we can see here what is working class environmentalism. This is a trajectory of a commodity in global capitalism. So it begins with extraction, the source, then producing, then circulation. In fact, circulation is also between extraction and production, but so, and then consumption, and then incineration, landfill, and so on. So what we can see here is that each time there is both a relation of domination on nature and a relation of domination in labor. There is no ecosystem destruction without an exploitation of labor. Exploitation of extractive labor, exploitation of agricultural and industrial labor, of logistic and assembly lines labor, of course, of environmental domestic labor, and in general, unwage labor. So well, this is the basic idea, I think, about this working class ecology. The fact that there is always a link between domination, destruction of nature on one side, and exploitation of labor on the other side. So the example, I was like 10 days ago in the south of France, near from Marseille, in the biggest harbor in France in Mediterranean Sea. And I met some workers unionized in the major union in France, so la CGT, General Confederation of Labor. They were all workers in steel industry, in plant industry. And they are like building a really amazing organization with an awful name. The name of the organization is Monitoring Committee for Industrial Activity in the Gulf of Fos-sur-Mer and its environmental impact. So really catchy what you want for the struggle. But in fact, it's really interesting because it's like workers and inhabitants of Fossemer working together. So working class ecology and environmental justice working together to note the effects, the polluted effects of the industry in the area. But see this amazing poster. So you have the sign of CGT, and here it is written, the first page of the document, 30 pages document, for a sustainable, eco-responsible steel plant. And you see the picture. The picture is like one of the biggest petrochemical harbor in Mediterranean Sea, and people, family, having bath there. And I had a discussion with the workers there, saying, okay, we can defend your job, I'm completely part of it, but until when should we defend this labor? And their position, which is like the contradiction, I think, about eco-modernism labor, but also the contradiction where we are to be, was the position was clear. We want decent job, quality jobs, green jobs, but we want these jobs. We want to work in this steel industry. And of course, I can't come and say, no, you shouldn't. I'm known to say, like, it's not a good position to say that. But it's really interesting because they are fighting against pollutions, against industrial pollutions in this area. And they told, everyone told that in their family, there are always people with cancer, with dead people, and so on. It's part of the identity of workers. And of the livelihood community, because a lot of care work and other work has to be done. So this is the question, a question for Stefania. Two questions, in fact, a methodological question and a strategic one. The methodological question is, how can we be sure that we are not lending ecological positions to actors who do not think in terms of the mainstream environmental movement? They don't talk about working class environmentalism, but they care a lot about pollution, occupational safety and health. So this is, for me, like a really methodological question. Under what conditions can we say that this is the case? The actors themselves don't think in these terms. And so there is immediately a strategic question, a political one. Can research, to read it, can research and researchers have a political function that of leading the labor movement to break with eco-modernism? Is it enough to politicize the question of health and safety at work as they do? Really, I think it's an important question. I don't have any idea about it. So just 5 minutes more.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Take your time.
Yeah, okay. I go to my second point, which is the second question I have for Stefania. I think with the concept of forces of reproduction, we see the irony of Stefania's work, even the humor of Stefania's work, because by productive forces or forces of production, Marx, Engels, and the general tradition of communism meant all the natural, technical, social, and scientific means available to a society to appropriate nature and produce social wealth. So these forces, for Engels or Marx, for example, embody the historical mediations between societies and their environment. However, the idea of a linear development of forces of production is the embodiment of eco-modernism in the communist movement. Maybe the most problematic idea from an ecological point of view is the idea of force of production or the development of force of production. I just want to use another example. It's an example, the invention by a company, maybe you know it, Monsanto Bayer, we invented the product Acceleron. These are biostimulants, mineral or microbial amendments that stimulate the immune defenses of plants and increase their capacity to enter into mycorrhizal symbiosis. Mycorrhizal symbiosis, it's a symbiosis between the roots of the plants and mushrooms in the soils. And this kind of mycorrhization of symbiosis develops the defense of the plants. So here we see that biocapitalism is not an extraction or destruction of nature. The biocapitalism is the development of productive forces or reproductive forces as an intensification of natural forces. So we could perhaps even hypothesize that there is an alienation of nature itself by a contemporary biotechnological capitalism that dispossesses nature of its passivity. The intensification of natural productive processes in the service of valorization leads to the limitation of nature's passive modes of existence. So I just want to make my point clear here. Contrary to the idea that modernity has reduced nature to a purely passive object, I think in the recent development of biocapitalism, it could be argued that the ecological history of biocapitalism is that of a pathological, disruptive intensification of the productivity of nature, for profit, of course. So this is not an objectification, not only an objectification of nature, but also an intensification of its productivity. And I think it's a really important development of biocapitalism. And as Stefania wrote in Forces of Reproduction, capitalism thus diminishes or annihilates the life-enhancing potentialities of the forces of reproduction, turning them into instruments of accumulation. This process depletes both the worker and the environment by extracting from them more work and energy than necessary and leaving them exhausted. So my last question is I don't know if it's provocative or not, but it's a political question. Do the forces of reproduction constitute in themselves the foundation of a revolutionary subject, political subject? Or under what condition can the forces of human and non-human reproduction constitute a political opposition to capitalist development and domination? So I go to my third point, which is linked to this one. Okay. It seems, and in fact, the talk of Stefania earlier showed it, that there is a new direction in Stefania's work. The idea of interspecific labor can be found in other places of the political ecology. For example, Donna Haraway's studies of symbiosis, in Deborah Birdrow's studies of multispecific communities, or in Alice Abati's study work on the labor of living beings. But I think what is interesting here is that, for example, for Haraway, symbiosis is an activity of engendering through interaction between different spaces, the main model of which is symbiosis. So symbiosis, I already told it, is a lasting and mutually beneficial biological association between two living organisms. So we see that Haraway's model of interspecific labor is a biological model of co-production. Of course, it's also about labor, but it's not the main focus. And so I think the importance of Stefania's approach here is that she intervenes in these debates as a Marxist-influenced feminist political ecologist. So the issue is therefore less about thinking about co-production about production, but about thinking labor, work, who is working, how, in which relation, social relation of domination. So I took my last example. It was a quotation of Marx, but it's like purely the Marxism. So, no, it's not. It's a joke because it's interesting that since the beginning of socialism, there are thinkers who think about the living beings as resistance to capital. Of course, it's completely minor. In Marx, it's just like one sentence in the chapter on machinery and modern industry in the Capital. But I think it's interesting. Of all the great motors handed down from the manufacturing period, horsepower is the worst, partly because a horse has a head of its own. This idea of an autonomy or a resistance of living beings to labor, I think it is really important. Why? Because maybe we could think about some kind of alliance, and it would be my last question for Stefania. This resistance of living non-humans to being put to work has been attested to many times by work in behavioral ethology or in sociology. This is not only the case in a general article from Jocelyn Porcher and Stephen Schmidt. Two Carlos collaborate in labor, question of sociology, where they studied the relationship of cows to the milking robots on a dairy farm. So the farmer, we can say, I think, the master in the world of Stefania, the farmer has set the rules that most of the cows follow. But that's my favorite part. Some of them are recalcitrant. They bypass the farmer, hide in a stall where they cannot be milked. Others show a lack of motivation by walking really slowly. Excessively slowly, it says, said Jocelyn Porcher and Stephen Schmidt. Some of them systematically stop the machine by blocking the robot and restart it as soon as the farmer enters the stable. So we see here that the problem for capital is the autonomy of the cows, but also the autonomy of the living beings. And this is precisely what milking machine designers are trying to reduce by turning the natural force with productive force into a natural material, a matter. I think this is really important. They don't want to have like individual living beings with their autonomy to work. They just want to have like a material to use. And so Porcher and Schmidt conclude that machine designer and agricultural engineers strive to prevent cows from walking, which is really interesting. It's the fact that it's a tendency from some engineers and development capitals to block the capacity, the autonomy of some others than humans. So this is my last question. It was the quotation of Stefania. But this is my last question, more ontological. What is the place of others than human in the working class? How to speak the language of political organizations in multi-species communities? If we think that the working class is a multi-species communities, how to organize? And how to give right to the multiplicity of experiences of domination if we extend the category of labor to others than humans? So that was my last question. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. Now we have the coffee break, and then I suppose that we can
Maybe half an hour.
half an hour, and then we come back here. Please put your name on the list of those that tomorrow will come with us.
Yes, because you have to count the number inside. Don't forget to put
Thank you very much. We will see in 50 minutes. Okay?
No.